I used to believe that love, like blood, never thinned. I thought that no matter how much time passed, no matter how many miles lay between us, my children would always be my compass, the people I could count on when life turned quiet and cold. But life has a way of humbling you, and sometimes the people you raised to stand tall will walk away the moment you stumble. It began quietly. The calls became shorter. The visits became rare. And then the silence arrived, a thick, suffocating thing that settled into the corners of my house like dust. I'd wake up to the empty hum of the refrigerator and the slow tick of a clock, wondering when I had stopped being someone they needed to call. When I got sick, it wasn't dramatic. No heart attack, no grand collapse in the street. Just a slow, inevitable decline, fatigue, dizziness, the body giving way like an old bridge under weight. I went into the hospital thinking it was temporary. I left realizing it was a turning point. I remember lying there one evening, looking at the ceiling. The light from the monitor flickered against the walls, and every few minutes a nurse would appear, smile politely, and vanish again. My phone was beside me, silent. I'd called my son twice that week, my daughter once. No answer, no message back. At first, I made excuses for them. They're busy, I told myself. They have families, they have jobs. The world doesn't revolve around an old man's discomfort. But the truth was simpler, harsher. I had stopped being part of their story. It's strange, isn't it, how easily love becomes background noise? How the voices that once cried for you in the night can grow into people who can't be bothered to answer your call. When I came home, the silence of that house felt louder than the hospital machines. Every wall echoed with memories, Christmas laughter, teenage arguments, the sound of their feet running through the hall. Now, nothing. Weeks passed, then months. I tried again, a message on my daughter's birthday, a call on my son's anniversary. Nothing but digital ghosts, blue ticks, read receipts, and an endless wait. So I stopped calling. I started sitting by the window instead, with my whiskey and my thoughts. I watched the mailman drop letters into boxes for people who probably had someone waiting for them. I'd wave at the neighbors, pretend everything was fine. But inside, I was learning something no man should have to learn, that loneliness doesn't kill you quickly. It kills you politely, a little each day, with a smile. Then came the turning point. A young woman from the neighborhood, a nurse, started checking in on me. Her name was Marcy. She'd knock on the door with groceries or bring soup when she knew I was too tired to cook. She didn't ask for anything. She didn't even stay long, just a few kind words, a bit of company. One evening, I asked her why she bothered. She laughed and said, "Because kindness doesn't need a reason, sir." It hit me then. This stranger had given me more warmth in a month than my own blood had given me in a year, and I began to see things differently. I started writing. Journals, letters, even short stories about my life, about growing up, about loss, about what it meant to outlive your usefulness. Marcy would read them sometimes. One day she said, "You should tell these stories to more people. There's wisdom here." Wisdom, funny word, isn't it? Usually, it's what people call pain after you've survived it. When I finally went back to the lawyer's office, I already knew what I was going to do. The illness had made one thing clear: time is the only real currency we have. And I wasn't going to spend what little I had left waiting for someone else's attention. I had built my fortune the hard way, 40 years of running construction contracts, losing sleep, building homes I'd never live in. $18 million to be exact. Every brick, every dollar, every sacrifice, all of it was meant for them. For my children. But what is inheritance, really, if the people inheriting you have already buried your existence? I sat in that chair across from my lawyer, the papers neatly stacked in front of me. He looked at me over his glasses, hesitant. "Are you sure you want to do this?" he asked. I nodded. "I'm certain." He looked down at the documents again. "You're leaving everything to 3 individuals you barely know. They're not strangers," I said. "They're the people who showed up. Marcy was one of them. The other 2 were a local librarian who used to bring me new books when she noticed I always borrowed the same ones, and a young man who fixed my mailbox after a storm without being asked. None of them were related to me. None of them shared my name, but all of them, in their quiet, uncalculated way, had shared something far more precious: humanity. After signing the will, I didn't feel vindicated. I didn't feel powerful. I just felt free. I knew that when I was gone, my children would finally call, not out of love, out of shock, confusion, anger, but that was fine. Maybe, in that moment, they'd understand the weight of absence. You see, revenge isn't always loud. It doesn't always come wrapped in fury or fire. Sometimes it's just the quiet act of saying no more. I didn't do it to hurt them. I did it because I had already been hurt enough. I did it to remind them, and maybe the world, that love, like respect, is not a birthright. It's earned, and it's kept alive through action. A few months after that, my daughter finally showed up. She stood on the porch, looking around the house like it was unfamiliar. She cried, asked why I hadn't reached out more. I smiled faintly and said I did. She looked down, ashamed. There was no shouting, no anger, just a silence that both of us understood too well. I offered her a seat. We talked lightly, cautiously. I didn't tell her about the will. I didn't need to. Some things are better learned from life itself. When she left, I poured myself another drink and stared at the fire. There was no satisfaction in any of it, only clarity. Because the older you get, the more you realize that family isn't defined by blood. It's defined by presence, by the people who show up when the world forgets your name. And sometimes it takes losing everything you thought mattered to discover who truly does. That's the quiet tragedy of growing old. You see the world in its truest form, stripped of pretense. The children you built your life around build new lives without you. And you learn, painfully, that your story doesn't end with applause. It ends with understanding. But there's a strange power in that, the power to let go, the power to stop waiting, the power to love without expecting it back. When I tell this story now, sitting here, glass in hand, fire crackling beside me, I don't tell it with bitterness. I tell it because it's real, because every man who's lived long enough knows this truth. One day, the phone will stop ringing, and all you'll have left is what you gave to others. And when that day comes, I hope you give it wisely, because love isn't measured in who shares your blood, it's measured in who shares your silence. In the end, I didn't change my will out of anger, I changed it out of awakening. Because sometimes it takes being forgotten by your own blood to remember your own worth. Let me take you back further, to when things first started to shift, to when I first noticed the foundations cracking beneath what I thought was solid ground. My son, Thomas, was the first one I held in my arms after 36 hours of labor that nearly took his mother from me. I remember standing in that hospital room at 3 in the morning, this tiny creature wrapped in blue, and thinking that I would do anything for him. Anything. That promise, I learned later, was both the truest thing I ever felt and the most dangerous vow I ever made. Because when you promise everything to someone, you teach them that everything is their birthright. You don't teach them gratitude, you teach them expectation. Thomas grew up strong, confident, the kind of boy who knew he was loved without question. Maybe that was the problem. Maybe I loved him so completely that he never learned to question whether love needed to be reciprocated. I worked 60-hour weeks to put him through private school. I missed birthdays and baseball games and parent-teacher conferences because I was building something bigger than those moments. I was building security. A future, a foundation he could stand on without ever worrying about the ground giving way beneath him. My daughter, Rebecca, came 5 years later. She was easier somehow, or maybe I was just more tired by then and mistook exhaustion for wisdom. She had her mother's gentleness and my stubbornness, a combination that made her both loving and unmovable when she set her mind to something. I remember teaching her to ride a bike in front of our house, running behind her with my hand on the seat, promising I wouldn't let go. When I finally did, she pedaled away from me without looking back, without even realizing I was no longer there. Maybe that should have been my first warning. Their mother, Catherine, died when Thomas was 28 and Rebecca was 23. Pancreatic cancer, the kind that moves too fast for hope to catch up. 6 months from diagnosis to funeral, 6 months of watching the strongest person I'd ever known reduced to something fragile and small. The kids came to the hospital during those final weeks. They sat by her bedside, held her hand, cried appropriately, but I noticed something that hollowed me out even as I tried to focus on Catherine. They were performing grief, not living it. They'd check their phones while she slept. They'd step out to take calls about work, about social plans, about the logistics of their lives that apparently couldn't pause even as their mother was dying. I told myself I was being unfair. People process grief differently. They were young. They didn't know how to face something this permanent. But Catherine knew. In one of her last coherent moments, she grabbed my hand and whispered, "You made it too easy for them. They don't know how to show up when it's hard." I didn't want to hear it then. I was losing her, and I couldn't bear the thought that she might be right about our children too. After she died, I expected them to rally around me the way families do after loss. I expected shared grief to bring us closer. Instead, it was like they'd fulfilled an obligation and could now return to their regularly scheduled lives. Thomas called every few weeks at first, the conversations brief and surface level. "How are you doing, Dad? I'm managing. Good, good. Listen, I've got to run, but I'll call you next week." Next week would become 2 weeks, then 3, then a month. Rebecca was similar, though she at least sent text messages with more frequency. Short updates about her job, her apartment, the yoga classes she was taking. Nothing that required a response beyond a thumbs-up emoji. Nothing that acknowledged I was a person rather than a recipient of status updates. I tried to be understanding. They were building their own lives. That's what you raise children to do, isn't it? To become independent, to not need you anymore. But there's a difference between not needing someone and forgetting they exist. The first time I went to the emergency room after Catherine died was about 8 months later. I was having chest pains that turned out to be anxiety and acid reflux. But at 72 years old, chest pains mean something. They keep you overnight, run tests, make sure you're not about to drop dead in their waiting room. I called Thomas from the hospital, left a voicemail. "Son, I'm at St. Mary's, had some chest pains. They're keeping me overnight for observation. Nothing serious, I think, but I wanted you to know." He texted me 6 hours later. "Sorry, Dad, was in meetings all day. Glad you're okay. Keep me posted. Keep me posted," like I was giving him updates on the weather. Rebecca didn't respond at all until the next afternoon, and only after I'd already been discharged and taken a cab home. "OMG, Dad, are you okay? Why didn't you call me?" I'd stared at that message for a long time before responding. "I did call. You were busy. I would have come. Would she have? I wanted to believe it, but the evidence suggested otherwise." That's when the pattern became clear to me, though I spent the next year trying to deny it. They'd respond when it was convenient. They'd show concern when it didn't require sacrifice. They'd maintain the appearance of family without doing any of the actual work of being family. I started testing it, though I hated myself for it. I'd call and leave vague messages. "Hey, just wanted to talk. Call me back when you can." Days would pass, sometimes weeks. I'd watch my phone like a teenager waiting for a crush to text back, and I'd feel pathetic and angry and sad all at once. When they did call back, it was always with an excuse. "Sorry, Dad, work has been insane." "Sorry, Dad, you know how it is with the kids." Wait, kids. Thomas had 2 children by then, 7 and 5 years old. My grandchildren, who I'd seen exactly twice in the past year, both times when I'd driven 3 hours to their house uninvited and knocked on the door. Rebecca's excuse was always the same. "I'm just so busy, Dad. Life is crazy right now. Life is always crazy." That's not an excuse, that's a choice about who you make time for and who you don't. I remember the day I fully understood what had happened. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I'd fallen in the garage while trying to get some boxes down from a high shelf. Nothing broken, just bruised ribs and a bruised ego. I managed to get myself inside and into a chair, but the pain was significant enough that I couldn't really move for a few hours. I called Thomas. Voicemail, I called Rebecca. Voicemail. I called them both again an hour later. Nothing. I sat in that chair, alone in the house Catherine and I had filled with 30 years of memories, and I realized something that changed everything. I had become a burden, not a father, not a person they loved, but an obligation they resented. Every call was an intrusion. Every need was an inconvenience. I was supposed to be the strong one, the one who never needed anything, the one who existed solely to provide and never to require. And now that I was old, now that I was slowing down, now that I occasionally needed help or company, or just someone to talk to, I had violated the unspoken contract. I had become inconvenient. That night, when Rebecca finally called me back at 9:30, I didn't answer. I just stared at her name on the screen until it stopped ringing. She didn't call again. She sent a text. Sorry I missed you earlier. Crazy day. Everything okay? I typed and deleted a dozen responses before finally settling on fine. Just wanted to talk. We should catch up soon. Love you. Love you. 2 words that should have meant everything and somehow meant nothing at all. Because love isn't a text message signed off with an emoji. Love is showing up. Love is calling back. Love is noticing when someone's absence from your life should concern you. The hospital stay that changed everything came about a year after that. I'd been feeling off for weeks, tired beyond what sleep could fix, dizzy, confused at times. I finally went to my doctor, who ran some tests and decided I needed to be admitted for observation. Possible stroke, possible heart issues, definitely something that required more than a 15-minute appointment to figure out. This time I didn't call my children. I'd learned that lesson. Instead, I called the hospital's social worker and asked them to list me as having no family. No emergency contacts, no next of kin. The nurse looked at me with sympathy that made me want to scream. No one at all, Mr. Morrison. No one who'll come, I said, and the truth of it sat between us like a living thing. I spent 4 days in that hospital. 4 days of tests, and 4 drips and nurses, who were kind in that professional way that makes you feel even more alone. 4 days of watching other patients receive visitors, watching families gather around beds, watching what I no longer had. On the second day, my roommate, a man named Frank, who'd had hip surgery, asked me where my people were. Busy, I said. He nodded like he understood, but then his daughter arrived with his grandkids, and I had to close the curtain around my bed and pretend I was sleeping. On the third day, Frank was discharged, and I was alone in the room. I remember lying there, looking at the empty bed next to mine, and thinking that was a preview of my future. Empty spaces where people used to be. When they finally released me, the diagnosis was stress, induced blood pressure spikes, and the beginnings of type 2 diabetes. Manageable with medication and lifestyle changes. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that warranted a hospital stay really, except that I'd let it go unchecked for so long that my body was starting to rebel. I took a cab home. The house was exactly as I'd left it. No one had noticed I'd been gone. No one had checked on me. No one had called. I sat in my living room, in the chair Catherine used to claim as hers, and I let myself feel the full weight of what my life had become. That's when Marcy appeared. Well, not appeared. She'd been my neighbor for 3 years, living 2 doors down with her mother. But that's when she started to see me, really see me. I was carrying groceries from my car a few days after getting home from the hospital. My ribs still ached from that fall in the garage weeks earlier, and I was moving slowly, 1 bag at a time. Mr. Morrison, she came jogging down the sidewalk, her scrubs still on from her shift at the hospital. Let me help you with those. I'm fine, I said automatically, because that's what men my age say even when we're clearly not fine. She smiled and took 2 of the bags anyway. I know you are, but let me help anyway. She carried them to my kitchen, set them on the counter, and then did something that broke me a little. She started putting them away, like it was the most natural thing in the world, like I was someone worth caring for. You don't have to do that, I said. I know, but I'm already here, so I might as well. She worked efficiently, asking me where things went, chatting about her shift at the hospital, treating me like a person rather than a charity case. When she was done, she washed her hands and turned to me with that bright, genuine smile. "There, all set. You need anything else while I'm here?" "No," I said, my throat tight, "but thank you, really." "Anytime, Mr. Morrison. I mean that. My mom works evenings, so I'm usually home around this time. If you ever need anything, just knock." After she left, I sat down and cried. Not dramatically, just quiet tears that I didn't try to stop. Because a stranger had shown me more kindness in 15 minutes than my own children had shown me in a year. That was the beginning of something that saved me, though I didn't know it then. Marcy started checking in regularly. She'd stop by after her shifts, bring me dinner she'd made extra of, sit and talk for 20 minutes about nothing important. She never acted like it was a burden. She never made me feel like I was taking up her time. She just showed up, and slowly, without me quite realizing it was happening, I started to heal. Not from the physical ailments. Those were managed with medication and doctor's visits, but from the wound of being forgotten. She made me feel seen again, human again, worth someone's time. About a month into this routine, I finally asked her why. Why she bothered with an old man she barely knew. Why she spent her limited free time checking on someone else's grandfather when she had her own life to live. She set down her coffee cup and looked at me with those clear, honest eyes. "You remind me of my grandfather," she said. "He died when I was 16, my mom's dad. He was the best man I ever knew, kind, funny, full of stories. But the last year of his life, after my grandmother died, he was so lonely. We lived 3 hours away, and we didn't visit enough. Mom was dealing with her own stuff. I was a teenager, didn't understand that old people could be lonely." She paused, and I saw tears in her eyes. "He died alone, in his house by himself, and no one found him for 2 days. 2 days, Mr. Morrison. He was alone for 2 days before a neighbor noticed his mail piling up and called the police." She wiped her eyes. "I can't undo that. I can't go back and visit him more or call him or just sit with him. But I can show up for you, and maybe that makes some kind of cosmic balance, you know. Maybe that's how I honor him, by making sure another good man doesn't have to be alone." I didn't trust myself to speak. I just nodded, and we sat in silence for a while, the kind of comfortable silence that only exists between people who understand each other. That conversation changed me, not just because of what she said, but because it made me confront something I'd been avoiding. The fact that my children might feel guilty about neglecting me, but not guilty enough to change their behavior. And if guilt wasn't enough to motivate them, what would be? The writing started shortly after that. I'd always been good with words, had to be in the construction business, where you're constantly writing bids and proposals and contracts. But I'd never written for myself, never written about myself. Marcy suggested it one evening when I was talking about Catherine, about the early years when we were broke and happy and building something from nothing. "You should write that down," she said. "Those stories are important. Who'd want to read about an old man's memories?" "I would," she said simply, "and I bet a lot of other people would too. There's wisdom in survival, Mr. Morrison, and you've survived a lot." So I started. Just a few pages at first, handwritten in a notebook I'd bought at the drugstore. Stories about growing up poor in Kentucky, about meeting Catherine at a church dance, about the early days of the construction business when I was too young and too stubborn to know I was probably going to fail. I wrote about Thomas's birth, about Rebecca's first day of school, about the Christmas when we'd had so little money that Catherine had sewn dolls by hand because we couldn't afford store-bought toys. I wrote about Catherine's death, about watching her disappear piece by piece while I stood helpless. I wrote about the silence that followed, about learning that grief isn't a thing that happens to you, but a thing you carry with you forever. Its weight shifting, but never fully leaving. And I wrote about my children, not with anger, not yet, but with a kind of bewildered sadness. I wrote about the boy who used to climb into bed with us during thunderstorms, who would fall asleep holding my hand. I wrote about where that boy had gone and who had taken his place. Marcy read some of it. She cried over certain passages, laughed at others, and when she was done, she looked at me with something like awe. "This is beautiful," she said. This is real. You need to share this. With who? With anyone who will listen. Start a blog. Go to the senior center and read some passages. Hell, self-publish it as a book. People need to hear this, Mr. Morrison. They need to know they're not alone in feeling forgotten. The idea terrified me, but it also excited me in a way nothing had in years. The thought that maybe my life had value beyond what I'd provided for others, that maybe my experiences, my stories, my survival, maybe all of that mattered in its own right. I did start a blog. Marcy helped me set it up, showed me how to post, how to share. I called it Letters to the Children Who Forgot. I published my first post not knowing if anyone would read it. Within a week, I had 200 comments. Within a month, thousands of people were reading every post. The comments section became a kind of support group for forgotten parents. People shared their own stories of children who drifted away, of holidays spent alone, of phone calls that never came. But they also shared stories of reconciliation, of boundaries set and respected, of second chances that worked. It was in reading those stories that I realized something crucial. I wasn't alone in this. There was a whole generation of parents who'd given everything to their children and received indifference in return. And more importantly, there were people who'd found ways forward that didn't require staying stuck in resentment. Some had confronted their children directly. Some had built new families from friends and neighbors. Some had simply learned to be at peace with the reality of their relationships, accepting them for what they were rather than mourning what they should have been. And then there were the ones who'd done what I was beginning to consider. They'd changed their wills. The comments about inheritance fascinated me. Some people were adamant that blood was blood, that you leave your estate to your children regardless of how they treat you. They're your children, these people would write. You don't punish them for living their own lives. But others disagreed vehemently. Why should people who can't be bothered to visit you inherit your life's work? They'd ask. Leave it to people who actually cared for you. Leave it to charity. Leave it to anyone except people who treated you like an obligation. I found myself in the latter camp. The more I thought about it, the more it made sense. I'd built my fortune over 40 years. 40 years of 12-hour days, of risky decisions, of sacrifices that aged me faster than time alone could. I'd done it for my family, yes, but that family had dissolved. Catherine was gone, my children were absent, what remained was the money itself, and the question of what it should represent. Should it represent obligation? Should Thomas and Rebecca inherit millions simply because they happened to be born to me, even though they couldn't be bothered to answer my calls? Or should it represent something more meaningful? Gratitude, respect, actual relationship. The more I considered it, the clearer it became. I didn't want my legacy to be enabling my children's indifference. I didn't want the last thing I ever gave them to be a reward for forgetting me. I wanted my money to go to people who understood that showing up matters. That presence has value. That kindness, even when inconvenient, is what makes us human. It took me 3 months to fully make the decision. 3 months of writing, of reading comments, of talking with Marcy and the librarian, Mrs. Chen, who'd been bringing me books for months, and the young man who'd fixed my mailbox, whose name I'd learned was David, and who was working 2 jobs to support his disabled mother. 3 months of observing who actually showed up in my life versus who merely existed in my phone contacts. And then, one morning, I woke up and knew with absolute certainty what I needed to do. I called my lawyer, Robert Jenkins, a man I'd known for 20 years. When I explained what I wanted, he was silent for a long moment. Thomas, are you sure about this? He was one of the few people who still called me by my first name. I've never been more sure of anything. This is going to devastate your children. They've spent the last few years devastating me, I said quietly. Maybe it's time they understood what that feels like. Another pause. I have to ask, is this revenge? Because if it is, I need to advise you that making decisions out of anger often leads to regret. It's not revenge, Robert. It's clarity. I'm leaving my money to people who actually showed up for me, to people who treated me like I mattered. That's not revenge, that's gratitude. He sighed. All right, if you're certain, I'll draw up the documents. But Thomas, I'm going to add a clause that allows you to modify this will at any time before your death. Just in case you change your mind. I won't, I said. But fine, add it. The process took a few weeks. Robert drafted everything carefully, making sure it would hold up to any legal challenge. $18 million, divided equally among 3 people who were not related to me by blood, but who'd shown me more kindness in months than my own children had shown me in years. $6 million to Marcy, the nurse, who decided loneliness was something she could help heal. $6 million to Mrs. Chen, the librarian who'd noticed when someone was reading the same books over and over because they had no one to recommend new ones. $6 million to David, the young man who'd fixed my mailbox and then kept checking on me because he knew what it was like to care for someone who needed help. When Robert called to tell me the documents were ready to sign, he asked one more time. Are you absolutely certain? I am, I said. These people showed me that family isn't about blood. It's about who chooses to show up when showing up is inconvenient. The day I went to sign the papers, I drove past the house where Thomas lived with his family. It was a beautiful home in a nice neighborhood, a home my money had helped him buy when he'd complained about high interest rates and down payment requirements. I'd written him a check for $100,000 without hesitation, because that's what fathers do. They help their children build their lives. I sat in my car across the street for a few minutes, watching. I saw my grandchildren playing in the front yard, saw my daughter-in-law come out to call them in for lunch. It was a picture of domestic happiness, and I wasn't in it. I'd been to that house exactly 3 times in the 2 years they'd lived there, always uninvited, always treated like an interruption, always made to feel that my presence was something they tolerated rather than welcomed. I drove away without knocking. At Robert's office, I signed every document carefully, reading each page even though he'd already explained everything. When it was done, he put his hand on my shoulder. I hope this brings you peace, Thomas. It already has, I said, and it was true. The act of making the decision had lifted something from me. I wasn't waiting anymore. I wasn't hoping for phone calls that wouldn't come. I wasn't measuring my worth by whether my children remembered I existed. I'd chosen to value the people who valued me, and there was profound freedom in that. Driving home, I felt lighter than I had in years. Not happy exactly. The situation that had led to this decision was too painful for happiness, but relieved, clear, certain that I'd done the right thing, not out of anger but out of respect for myself and gratitude for the people who'd showed me kindness. When I got home, I did something I hadn't done in months. I called Thomas. He answered on the 4th ring, sounding distracted. Hey Dad, what's up? I'm kind of in the middle of something. I just wanted to hear your voice. I said, Oh, okay, well, I'm here. How are you doing? I'm doing well, actually, really well. That's great, Dad. Listen, I've got to run, but let's catch up soon, okay? Sure, son, I love you. Love you too, Dad. The line went dead, and I sat there holding my phone, looking at his name on the screen. Love you too, Dad, said so automatically, so carelessly, like a reflex rather than a feeling. I didn't call him again after that. The next time my phone rang with one of their numbers, it was 3 weeks later, Rebecca, calling at 9 at night. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. Hi, sweetheart, I said. Dad, oh my God, I'm so glad I caught you. Listen, I need to ask you something. Not how are you. Not I'm sorry I haven't called. Just straight to what she needed. What is it? So, you know how I told you about that opportunity with the gallery. The one where I could display my photographs. Rebecca had been an amateur photographer for years, more hobby than profession. But she talked about it like it was her life's calling. I remember. Well, they want to do it, but there's a fee for the space, and it's more than I expected. I was wondering if you could help me out. It's only $15,000. Only $15,000. Said like it was pocket change. Rebecca, when's the last time you visited me? Silence. Then, what? When's the last time you came to see me, or called just to talk, or asked how I was doing? Dad, I've been busy. You know how it is. I do know how it is. I know exactly how it is. And the answer is no. No. She sounded genuinely shocked, like the possibility that I might refuse had never occurred to her. I'm not giving you $15,000, Rebecca. I'm not giving you anything anymore. Dad, are you serious? This is my career we're talking about. This could be my big break. And my health was my life we were talking about when I was in the hospital, and you didn't call for 3 days. Priorities, right. That's not fair. I apologized for that. You apologized through a text message, Rebecca, and then you disappeared again for another month. Her voice got cold. So this is what? Punishment. You're punishing me for having my own life. No, I said, and I was surprised by how calm I felt. I'm just choosing not to subsidize people who treat me like an ATM instead of a father. She started crying. I can't believe you're being like this. Mom would be so disappointed in you. That one stung, mostly because part of me wondered if it was true. But I thought about Catherine's last words. You made it too easy for them. And I knew she'd understand. Maybe, I said, but your mother also taught you that relationships require effort, that love is a verb, not just a feeling. You might want to think about that. I hung up before she could respond. My hands were shaking slightly, but I didn't feel angry. I felt sad, but also strangely at peace, because I'd finally said what needed to be said, and whether it changed anything or not, at least I'd been honest. Thomas called 2 days later. I didn't answer. He left a voicemail. Dad, Rebecca told me about your conversation. I don't know what's going on with you, but we need to talk. This isn't like you. Call me back. It wasn't like me. That was true. The old me would have apologized, would have sent Rebecca the money with a note saying of course I'd help, would have swallowed the hurt and pretended everything was fine. But the old me had gotten me to this point. Alone, forgotten, taken for granted. Maybe it was time to try being someone new. I didn't call him back. Instead, I spent the evening with Marcy. She'd brought over her mother, Linda, who was a lovely woman with the same kind spirit as her daughter. We ate dinner together, the three of us, and we talked about real things. Not surface pleasantries, but actual conversation. About Linda's late husband, about Marcy's struggles with nursing school years ago, about my construction business, and some of the interesting projects I'd worked on. They asked questions, they listened to the answers, they treated me like someone whose experiences had value. After they left, I stood in my kitchen washing the dishes, and I thought about how strange it was that the family I'd built through biology barely acknowledged my existence, while these women who shared no DNA with me had somehow become the people I looked forward to seeing. The universe has a strange sense of irony sometimes. A week after the will was signed, I got a call from Thomas's wife, Jennifer, that was unusual enough that I answered, "Hi, Jennifer. Hi, Dad." She was the only one who still called me that, even though we'd never been particularly close. "Listen, I'm calling because I'm worried about Thomas." "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong, exactly. But he told me about your conversation with Rebecca, about you refusing to help her with the gallery thing, and I wanted to talk to you about that." Here it comes, I thought. The intervention, what about it? "I think you were right." I blinked. "I'm sorry, what?" "I think you were right to say no, and I think someone needed to say it a long time ago." She sighed, and I could hear the exhaustion in it. "Dad, can I be honest with you? Please. Your kids take you for granted. I've been watching it happen for years, and it's bothered me, but it wasn't my place to say anything. But since you're already having difficult conversations, I figured maybe it was time for some honesty. I'm listening. They talk about you like you're just there, like you're a resource they can tap into whenever they need something, but not a person who might need things too. Thomas will complain about his job, his stress, his challenges, but if I suggest calling you just to check in, he waves it off. Says you're fine, you've always been fine, you don't need anything from him. She paused, and I've tried to push back on that. I've reminded him that you're getting older, that you've been alone since Mom died, that maybe he should visit more often. But he just gets defensive. Says he's busy, says you understand, says he'll get around to it. Why are you telling me this? Because I want you to know that not all of us are blind to it. And because I think what you're doing, setting boundaries, saying no, that's healthy. That's overdue. And even if Thomas can't see it yet, I hope eventually he will. Does he know you're calling me? God, no. He'd be furious, but I couldn't not call. You've been a good father, Dad. You've been generous to a fault. And I hate watching them take advantage of that. After we hung up, I sat for a long time thinking about that conversation. It was the most honest anyone had been with me in years, and it came from someone I'd barely considered part of my inner circle. It confirmed what I already knew, but had been afraid to fully acknowledge, that my children's neglect wasn't accidental or temporary. It was habitual, enabled, something they'd grown comfortable with because I'd never demanded anything different. The thing about setting boundaries, I was learning, is that it disrupts the entire system. You can't change one part without affecting the whole. And when you've spent decades being the person who never says no, who never complains, who never demands reciprocity, suddenly standing firm feels like revolution. My children weren't the only ones who noticed the change. I started getting calls from other family members. My brother, who I hadn't heard from in 6 months, suddenly wanted to have lunch and catch up. My sister-in-law called to invite me to a family barbecue, something I'd never been invited to before. It was transparent enough to be insulting. They'd heard through the family grapevine that something was off with me, that I was acting strange, and now they were circling like concerned vultures trying to figure out if there was a will to contest. I declined the invitations politely. I'd spent enough of my life accommodating people who only saw me when they needed something. The blog continued to grow. I was posting twice a week now, sometimes more when I had stories I needed to tell. The audience had grown to tens of thousands, and the comments section had become a kind of community. People would share advice, offer support, challenge each other's perspectives. It was everything family was supposed to be but often wasn't. Honest, supportive, present. One post in particular resonated with people. I wrote about the difference between loneliness and solitude. Loneliness, I wrote, is the ache of wanting connection and not having it. It's reaching for the phone and having no one to call. It's the silence of a house that feels like absence rather than peace. But solitude is different. Solitude is choosing quiet because you've filled yourself up enough that you don't need constant external validation. Solitude is reading a book without guilt, taking a walk without purpose, sitting with your own thoughts and finding them adequate company. I'd spent the first year after Catherine's death in loneliness. I'd spent the last 6 months discovering solitude, and the difference I was learning wasn't about how many people were in your life, but about whether you needed them to make you feel whole. Marcy read that post and told me it made her cry. That's exactly what my grandfather needed, she said. Someone to help him discover solitude instead of drowning in loneliness. You gave me that. I told her, you and Mrs. Jen and David. You showed me that connection doesn't have to come from the people I expected it to come from. Family is what you make it, she said simply. Blood is just biology. Family is choice. I had that quote printed and framed, hung it in my living room where I'd see it every day, because it was true, and it was a truth I'd needed to learn. 6 months after signing the will, I finally heard from both of my children at once. They showed up at my house unannounced on a Saturday afternoon. I opened the door to find them standing on my porch, looking uncomfortable and determined in equal measure. Can we come in? Thomas asked. I almost said no. Almost told them they should have called first, should have asked whether I had time for them, should have shown even a basic level of consideration. But I was curious about what had prompted this sudden joint appearance, so I stepped aside and let them in. We sat in the living room, me in my chair, them on the couch Catherine used to love. They looked around the space like they were seeing it for the first time, noticing changes I'd made, new curtains, different artwork, the framed quote about family on the wall. The place looks nice, Dad, Rebecca said. Thank you. Awkward silence. Finally, Thomas spoke. Dad, we need to talk about what's been going on. What's been going on? I repeated. You know what I mean. You've been distant. You refuse to help Rebecca. You haven't been answering our calls. I've answered every call you've made in the last 6 months. I said, all 3 of them. He frowned. That's not fair. We've been busy. I spent 4 days in the hospital in February, I said quietly, alone. I didn't tell you because I'd learned by then that you wouldn't come. Was I wrong? They exchanged glances. We didn't know you were in the hospital. Rebecca said, because I didn't call you. I agreed. I didn't see the point. You demonstrated pretty clearly that my health wasn't a priority for you. That's not true, she protested. We care about you. You care about me in theory. I said, you care about the idea of having a father. But you don't care about the actual work of maintaining a relationship with me. Thomas leaned forward. Dad, where is this coming from? This isn't like you. No, it isn't. The old me would have kept quiet, would have kept accepting crumbs of your attention and pretending it was enough. But I'm 70, 3 years old, and I don't have time to pretend anymore. I looked at both of them, these people I'd raised, these strangers wearing my children's faces. When's the last time either of you called me just to talk? Not because you needed something, not because it was a holiday, but just because you wanted to hear my voice. Silence. When's the last time you visited me, actually made the drive, sat in this room, spent time with me? More silence. When's the last time you thought about whether I might be lonely, whether I might need help, whether I might be struggling? Rebecca's eyes filled with tears. We thought you were fine. You always said you were fine. Because that's what you wanted to hear. Because admitting I was lonely, that I was hurt, that I needed more from you. That would have made you uncomfortable. And I've spent your entire lives trying not to make you uncomfortable. I stood up, suddenly too agitated to sit, but your mother was right. I made it too easy for you. I gave you everything and asked for nothing, and I taught you that my needs didn't matter, that I existed solely to serve your needs, and now, when I'm old and actually need something, not money, not help moving, just basic human connection, you're nowhere to be found. Thomas stood too. That's not fair, Dad. We have our own lives. We have our own families, our own responsibilities. I know you do, and I'm not asking you to give those up. I'm asking you to make room for me in them, to call occasionally, to visit without it being a major production, to treat me like I matter. You do matter, he insisted. Do I? I challenged, because from where I'm standing, I matter when it's convenient. I matter when you need something, but the rest of the time, I'm just background noise in your life. Rebecca was crying openly now. I'm sorry, Dad. I didn't realize. That's exactly the problem. I interrupted. You didn't realize because you didn't think about it. You didn't consider what my life might be like. You just assumed I'd always be here, always available, always fine. I sat back down, suddenly exhausted. I'm not trying to hurt you. I'm trying to be honest. And the honest truth is that I've felt forgotten for a very long time. And I've decided I'm done accepting that. They stayed for another hour. We talked, really talked, about the patterns that had developed, about the distance that had grown, about the mutual hurt and misunderstanding. It wasn't comfortable. There were tears, raised voices, moments of defensiveness on both sides, but it was honest in a way we hadn't been in years. When they left, there were no easy resolutions, no promises that felt trustworthy after so many broken ones, just a tentative agreement to try to do better, to be more present, to actually show up for each other. I watched them drive away and felt no relief, no satisfaction, just a quiet sadness that it had come to this, that my children needed to be confronted with their own neglect before they could even see it. The next day, Marcy came by. She took one look at my face and said, "What happened?" I told her about the visit, about the conversation, about the painful honesty that had finally been spoken. "Do you think they'll change?" she asked. "I don't know." I admitted. "I hope so, but I'm not counting on it." "And the will?" "Stays as it is," I said firmly, "because whether they change or not, the truth remains. You, Mrs. Chen, and David were there when I needed someone. You showed me what family actually looks like. And that deserves recognition." She hugged me then, and I let myself lean into it, let myself accept the comfort she was offering. "You know," she said when she pulled back, "you're teaching me something important." "What's that?" "That it's never too late to demand better. That age doesn't mean you have to accept being treated poorly. that dignity matters at every stage of life. I smiled. Your grandfather would be proud of you. I think he'd be proud of you too, she said, for standing up for yourself, for showing other people it's okay to do the same. Over the next few months, my children did try harder. Thomas called weekly, actually weekly, not his previous definition of weekly that meant monthly at best. Rebecca visited twice, bringing her boyfriend to meet me for the first time. They asked questions about my life, about the blog, about the friends I'd made. It was better. Not perfect, not even good sometimes, but better. I appreciated the effort even as I remained wary, wondering if it would last or if this was temporary reformation driven by guilt rather than genuine change. But I was also learning something important. I didn't need their change to be okay. I'd built a life that worked without their presence. I had friends who showed up. I had a community online that valued my words. I had purpose in my writing and peace in my solitude. Whether my children became who I'd hoped they'd be was no longer the defining measure of my happiness. They could add to my life if they chose to show up authentically, but they couldn't destroy it with their absence anymore, because I'd finally learned what Marcy had tried to teach me from the beginning, that kindness doesn't need a reason, but neither does self-respect. That family is about choice and presence, not obligation and biology. That love, real love, is measured in who shares your silence, who shows up when it's inconvenient, who treats your time and your life as valuable. The will stayed unchanged. $18 million, divided among 3 people who'd shown me that humanity transcends bloodlines. It felt right in a way that leaving it to children who'd forgotten I existed never would have, because inheritance isn't about DNA. It's about legacy. It's about passing on what matters to people. We'll honor it, and what mattered to me, I'd finally learned, wasn't money or property or even family trees. What mattered was showing up, being present, treating people with dignity regardless of their age or usefulness. Marcy, Mrs. Chen, and David had shown me those things. They'd reminded me that I mattered not because of what I could provide, but because I was human, and that alone made me worthy of consideration. That was worth more than any inheritance my children could claim through genetics alone. 1 year after signing the will, on a cold evening in November, I gathered my small, chosen family, Marcy, her mother Linda, Mrs. Chen, and David, for dinner at my house. I'd cooked, something I'd gotten better at since Catherine died, and we sat around the table she and I had bought 30 years ago, sharing food and stories and laughter. At one point, David asked me what the happiest moment of my life had been. I thought about it for a long time. There were obvious answers. My wedding day, the births of my children, big business successes. But those weren't what came to mind. This, I said finally, right now. This moment, they looked at me with surprise and affection. Why? Mrs. Chen asked. Because for the first time in years, I'm sitting with people who actually want to be here, who chose to spend their evening with an old man because they value his company, not because they feel obligated or need something from him. That's worth more than any highlight reel moment from my past. Marcy raised her glass. To chosen family. To chosen family, we all echoed, and the sound of our glasses meeting filled the room like music. Later that night, after everyone had left and I was alone with my thoughts and my whiskey, I thought about the blog post I wanted to write, about this journey from loneliness to solitude, from feeling forgotten to feeling free, from measuring my worth by blood connections to understanding that worth is intrinsic. I thought about all the other forgotten parents out there, sitting in quiet houses, wondering when they became invisible to the people they'd raised. I thought about what I'd want to tell them, that it's okay to demand better, that it's okay to redirect your love to people who appreciate it, that it's okay to change your will, change your priorities, change your entire definition of family if the one you were born with can't see your value. That inheritance is about gratitude, not entitlement. That leaving your money to people who actually showed up isn't revenge, it's justice. That choosing yourself, finally, after decades of choosing everyone else, isn't selfish, it's survival. I started typing, and the words came easily, flowing from a place of heart. One wisdom and peace. To anyone reading this who feels forgotten, I wrote, please know that you are not alone. There are thousands of us, invisible to our own children, struggling to understand how the people we loved most became the people who care least. But I also want you to know that it gets better, not because they change, necessarily, but because you do. Because you learn that your worth isn't dependent on their recognition. Because you discover that family can be built, not just inherited. Because you finally understand that the people who show up when it's inconvenient are worth more than the people who show up when it's easy. Change your will if you need to. Redirect your resources to people who value you. Don't spend your final years supporting people who couldn't be bothered to support you when you needed it. That's not bitterness, that's wisdom, that's self-respect. That's the final gift you can give yourself, the gift of knowing that you mattered to someone, even if that someone wasn't who you expected. I published the post at midnight, too tired to check for typos, too at peace to worry about the response. And then I went to bed, in the house that was no longer haunted by silence, but filled with it, like a full cup that has no need for more. Because I had learned, finally, that love isn't measured in who shares your blood. It's measured in who shares your silence, in who shows up when showing up is inconvenient, in who treats you like you matter. Because they believe fundamentally that you do, and I had that, not from the people I'd expected, not from the children I'd raised, but from strangers who became family by choosing to see me when no one else did. That was enough, more than enough. It was everything. In the end, I didn't change my will out of anger. I changed it out of awakening, because sometimes it takes being forgotten by your own blood to remember your own worth. And sometimes the greatest inheritance you can leave isn't money or property. It's the lesson that dignity matters, that presence counts, that showing up is how love is actually spelled. My children would learn that lesson when I was gone, and whether it changed them or not, at least the lesson would be taught. At least someone would remember that love, real love, requires more than biology. It requires choice. It requires effort. It requires showing up. And that's worth more than $18 million. That's worth everything.